and the neck, Yanis Iqbal. We're on the final chapter of this work, and then all of you in People's Republic of Fork will be able to vote on what we're going to be reading from Iskra next. So keep your eye on my channel. I'll be putting a vote in there at some point after tonight. Chapter 5: Philosophy as an Act of Life. Gaza and Anti-Colonial Praxis. In his 1918 article, Fear of Collapse of the Old and Fight for the New, Vladimir Lenin talked about intellectuals who were ready to recognize socialism if humanity, quote, could jump straight into it in one spectacular leap, without any of the friction, the struggles, the exploiters' gnashing of teeth, or their diverse attempts to preserve the old order, or smuggle it back through the window, without the revolutionary proletariat responding to each attempt in a violent manner. Hear that? Does that sound familiar? Does that sound anything, for example, like, I don't know, like when Hassan, for just to take one example, said that, the revolution or the collapse of the US empire is going to be quote unquote bad for everybody. Just an example of that type of outlook that we can see literally today, that Lenin was talking about in his collected works, volume 26. Situated at a distance from the actual political struggle, these intellectuals want to avoid the extremes of political struggle, preferring the path of conciliation. The current colonial genocide in Gaza has generated a similar phenomenon. Western philosophers have condemned the October 7th attack launched by Hamas, advocating for the adoption of a more peaceful approach. The term Western is used not to refer to ethnic identity, but to indicate the political, cultural, and ideological network of influence managed by the US led imperialist order. Nested within this order, philosophy has separated itself from the domain of politics, passing judgments upon its dynamics. This book performs a reverse operation. It considers politics as a productive form of thinking that sets the boundaries of conceptualization for philosophy. The standpoint of mass struggle is used to underline the severe inadequacies that afflict the intellectual framework of Western philosophers. The pitfalls of political ontology. According to Jody Dean, the criticism of Hamas should be carried out according to the political exigencies that structure the conjecture. This is from Akio Kibuku and Jody Dean, Leadership and Liberation and Exchange, Boston Review 2024, that we're going to be quoting from on this page. So, Jody Dean, the criticism of Hamas should be carried out according to the political exigencies that structure the conjecture. Against the background of the imperialist demonization of Hamas as a group of terrorists, even a nuanced critique of its actions contributes to the dehumanization of the Palestinian struggle. As Dean puts it, quote, what matters is knowing when disagreement and criticism, especially in public, is likely to be useful, when it might move the struggle forward, and when it's little more than posturing or condensation, an expression of our attachment to the singularity of our own feelings and position. Acting on the basis of such knowledge is the essence of solidarity. Even when every effort is taken to disagree with nuance and good faith, criticism and condemnation can do serious damage to a movement. undermining the fragile alliances that hold it together under enormous threat and pressure. Oh, from that same work. Ika Kabuku thinks that conjectural instance on the political effects of critique risks silencing the multitude of paths that lie beneath the binaries of mainstream discourse. Our political predicament consists in the fact that either or trends to structure much thinking on the subject of international solidarity with Palestine. Are there only two positions available to us in the global solidarity movement with Palestine: to support or condemn Hamas? In opposition to this binary, Kibuku asserts that the recognition of Hamas's political significance can very well be accompanied by a questioning that probes into the workings of its leadership vis-a-vis the broader Palestinian liberation movement. Must such questions necessarily etch imperialist demonizations of Hamas and imply its condemnation as a political formation? Here, we come to the crux of the debate. Can the discursive terms of struggle be detached from the immediacy of existing politics? Can the historical weight of a definite political struggle between imperialists and Hamas be perforated to create a multiplicity of strategies? Kibakshu says that this perforation is completely possible. Quote, "It is possible to support a resistance movement while critiquing elements of its leadership and actions, even during long periods of backlash and repression. In fact, acts of critique enable the political transformation and strengthening of our movements through mutual engagement with our political differences." But from where does one undertake the critique of Hamas? Where is the alternative location to which we can migrate in order to escape the stringency of the zero-sum possibilities we face? Kabuchu doesn't elaborate this because she simply presumes that there exists a capacity for innovation that can generate creative multiplicities. But this assumption is belied by the reality that obtains in Palestine. In the colonized social formation, multiplicity exists not as an expression of a creative capacity, but in the form of a historically produced structure of radical fragmentation. According to Abdul Jawad Omar, the structure has led many Palestinians to begin questioning the very notion of our unity as a people, pondering whether the discrepancy in the capacity of Palestinians to resist is a sign of the weight of the geographic divisions and the various colonial governmentalities after 75 years. Hamas has eroded defeatist sentiments of disunity by destroying the myth of Israeli invincibility, showing how Palestinians are capable of attacking the Zionist security regime. Many of Hamas's critics offer nothing that could match its work to accumulate power in the Gaza Strip, and its opening of a strategic Pandora's box that has overflowed and deformed the colonial regime, providing a historical moment that includes among its many possibilities the potential for Palestinian liberation. Give me those land back emotes. Hamas's practical efforts to dissolve the reality of radical fragmentation demonstrate that there is no pre-existing creative force that can be harnessed to practice a politics of multiplicity. Instead of grounding politics in the ontological force of multiplicity, one has to realize that politics is a groundless procedure that creates truths through its own constructive dynamic. In other words, there is no reservoir of multiplicity that can supply resources for the execution of political initiatives. In the present situation, the critique of Hamas cannot unleash a dynamic of mutual exchange because there exists no other political force that can parallel Hamas's militant ability to practice resistance against the Zionist regime. I guess Larry isn't just blowing smoke all the time when I say critical support is deeply misunderstood and misframed in the West. This is a very good work for me to read for my own ego. Let me just say that much. I have said that for fucking years that literally how like with DPRK for example, the people that have what is your criticism of North Korea though? And I'm like, I don't have a criticism of North Korea because you tell me who's going to do it better than what North Korea's own government is doing right now. Tell me, show me the opposition that has the fucking mass support and the militant capability and the correct political line that the Workers' Party of Korea does. That is able to take, that would be able to take their place. I'll wait. Right? And until then, you can take your critiques and you can shove them up your goddamn ass. This is what I've wanted to say to people, but I haven't because I'm very polite. This is just, you know, it's just nice to read it in this work. That's all. Anyway, I'll continue. I will continue now. Don't mind me. I might have got environmental drunk from Dave earlier, okay? Dave gave me the environmental drunk. None of my kick alerts are making any sound for some fucking reason today. God damn it, Kick. It was just nice to read it in this book because I think this might be the first time I've really saw that put into writing like this, actually. So I'm feeling, it's, you know, it feels good to read that because I have been saying, some of you who have been watching this stream for years with me, even when I was only on the Green site, know that I have been literally saying like about this and critical support and how the critical support leftists are a bunch of fucking dogmatists. Actually, they're the purity fetishists this entire time. It's amazing. Now that I'm seeing it in this work, so that blew my mind a little bit. I'm now recovered and ready to continue. Okay. In other words, I'm going to say this part again though. In other words, there is no reservoir of multiplicity that can supply resources for the execution of political initiatives. In the present situation, the critique of Hamas cannot unleash a dynamic of mutual exchange because there exists no other political force that can parallel Hamas's militant ability to practice resistance against the Zionist regime. It is this militant capacity that has earned Hamas universal condemnation from imperialist hegemons. A critique of Hamas assumes the existence of an alternative agent of politics that can generate revolutionary effects greater in intensity than the one generated by Hamas. This, by the way, actually, this is beautiful after the conversation we just had about Russia as well, because this, by the way, is the same reason why the Communist Party in Russia is not a lackey or a puppet of Putin, but understands the popularity that Putin and his party have and use that for the benefit of building this anti-imperialist struggle as strong as possible. They recognize this about that party. Insofar as there is no such political revolutionary agent to which the critique of Hamas can address itself, such criticisms feed into the entity that is churning out anti-Hamas propaganda. I do encourage you to comment on the read and ask questions about it, though. Namely, the imperial war machine. Critique is revolutionary only when it is embodied in the practical struggle to strengthen revolutionary power in the midst of an existential struggle. Disembodied criticism fails to find any political referent that can tilt the balance of power in favor of liberation. As a result, it joins the general circulation of imperialist propaganda against Hamas. Yes, exactly. Your fucking quote-unquote critique of DPRK at this time is indeed just imperialist regurgitation of bullshit against DPRK. No exceptions. None. Your critique of Hamas is nothing but a circulation of imperialist propaganda against Hamas. No exceptions. Period. Same with Iran. Your critique of Iran at this time is nothing but a circulation of imperialist propaganda. Period. No matter how well-intentioned you are, no matter how nuanced you are, you have to understand that we actually want to meet people where they're at and not tail them like a bunch of reactionaries. And when you do that, when you offer that type of useless, with disconnected critique, that is what you're doing. And that's what we have to understand. You're not offering a nuance. You're not offering any, because what you're doing is then tailing an already incorrect position, an anti-Iran, anti-Palestinian, anti-Hamas, anti-whatever position. You're entertaining that by trying to by trying to legitimate yourself, by virtue signaling, by whatever to this. And I understand a lot why people do it. I do. Because you feel very, very emotionally towards the people in those countries that might be overlooked. And that's very good and that's very noble. But you have to understand that people don't approach it that way. And right now, the overwhelming majority of people are anti-Iran or anti-whatever in general, but are able to be brought to a better understanding of it because of this unleashing of the perspective that October 7th has started, in a way. Like this book is talking about. That has allowed us a very important key in getting people over that hump now. And we revolutionaries need to make use of that. To connect it to the USSR, to connect it to to connect it to that Stalingrad struggle, to connect it to DPRK and Vietnam and Laos and Cuba, right? That's what October 7th has done. Before that, the possibility was different. You have literally seen, since October 7th, we should have some credit. Sure, we all tried our best, but it was really, how many people have noticed a serious, complete change of people's attitudes and willingness to even listen to you about Cuba or DPRK or Hamas since October 7th. That has changed everything in our ability to reach people. And the credit for that should largely go to the resistance fighters, to Hamas, right? They legitimated that. They gave us the ability to connect this then to Russia, to all of these other things in a way that people cannot now ignore because of the fucking genocide that they saw on their phones. Which then brings us to the next part, liberal politics. The ontological grounding of politics in a pre-existing force is a common strategy among Western philosophers. While Kibuku opts for multiplicity, others, as we have seen, deploy the language of possibility. The possibility of peace. None of the philosophers inquire into the source of these possibilities. It is simply assumed that peace between Israel and Palestine can be ensured through non-violent means, without the necessity of anti-colonial struggle. This ontological turn in Western philosophy mirrors the liberal politics that has been implemented through the Oslo peace process. After the isolation of Iraq and the downfall of the Soviet Union, a pallor of defeat hung upon the anti-systematic forces. In this conjecture, the necessity of political struggle was suppressed by the attractiveness of arbitration. Full-scale decolonization was replaced by the management of legally granted statehood. The depoliticization of the Palestinian movement was strategically beneficial for Zionist power. Haider Ed writes, quote, "By winning the 1948, 1956, and 1967 wars, and by getting international Arab and Palestinian recognition, Israel, as an apartheid settler colonial state, has hoped to move onto a new stage, a stage that requires the formation of a new consciousness, quote unquote, among colonized Palestinians. Herein lies the danger of Oslo. The creation of a new paradigm through which the consciousness of the supposed enemy, the other, is washed out and replaced with a one-dimensional mentality through the construction of a fiction, two states for two people, the goal of which is unobtainable." Haider Ed, The Oslo Accords, a critique, Al Jazeera, 13th of September 2013. There's a link here if you want to read that article. Post-Oslo depoliticization worked through the forgetting of the power balances that constitute the reality of the Zionist settler colonial rule. Israel and Palestine became two mortal entities engaged in a process of mutual recognition. Lemir Yuda waxes eloquent about how Oslo sheared off Palestinian national liberation from the geoeconomics of Arab-Israeli conflict, converting it into a unique Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whereas earlier, the Palestinian struggle functioned as a zero-sum game, evoking feelings of existential threat and profound insecurity, quote unquote. Oslo shaped it into a question of dialogue that could be solved through representative institutions of local governance. From Lemir Yuda and Emily Bazelon, New York Times Magazine, Why the Oslo Accords Between Israelis and Palestinians Failed. Thus, the peace process can be seen to have inaugurated a new discourse of morality, wherein both Israel and Palestine became partners who needed to trust each other and articulate their concerns. Sergei Sherman articulates this briefly, very clearly. Quote, "The wisdom of Oslo is a credit to the negotiators, who came to recognize the validity of each other's guiding narratives, of Israel's return to a promised land after an unspeakable tragedy, and of the Palestinians' dispossession and humiliating occupation. These narratives could not necessarily be reconciled, but the negotiators were able to escape the zero-sum feuding over who was in the right and acknowledge the other's yearnings, history, and grievings." Serge Schumann, Why Oslo Still Has Relevance. The New York Times Magazine, 30th of October, 2023. Good God. The moral discourse of the peace process flattens the historical unevenness of settler colonialism. The binary of the colonizer and the colonized into an abstract universe of guiding narratives. Each nation has its own guiding narrative, which interacts with the other narratives present on the global platform. This is essentially the transposition of the ontology of liberalism onto the scene of international politics. Just as the liberal individual expresses their own views in front of a public sphere that has learned the values of tolerance, so nations also express their own guiding narratives in front of other tolerant nations. The ensuing balanced discussion eliminates any misunderstandings. In opposition to the liberal ethics discussion, Edward Said notes that the conflict between Palestine and Zionism is not just a misunderstanding, but a real opposition between opposed forces. Furthermore, a conflict embedded in a specific region, having a concrete history, and bringing into play a conjunction of many different regional, international, and cultural factors. Edward Said, The Question of Palestine, New York Vintage Books, 1980. Outside the apolitical universe of liberal morality, one can find historical explanations for how nation states are constituted. Israel's establishment in 1948 was intimately interlaced with the logic of imperialism. During its period of existence, Israel has served as a bulwark against Soviet influence. Though the USSR did initially support the creation of Israel using chauvinist theories like Yishvanism, which, by the way, Stalin fought against. Larry's note, Stalin fought against that. And its predecessor, and the thing that came before it, by the way, Stalin also ideologically fought against. Larry note there for you. And the in-house note there comes from Ahmad As-Saidi. Communism and Zionism in Palestine, Israel, A Troubled Legacy, Holy Land Studies 9, number 2, 2010. Yes, again, the USSR did initially support the creation of Israel using chauvinist theories like Yishvanism. Yes, it's stated right here. Again, it wasn't a monolith. Even in Stalin's time, this was a trend that he had to combat. There's lots of reasons for this. If you want to have a better understanding of this particular struggle, you have to, I guess the best way is to look at that book that we read before, which was Stalin History Critique of a Black Legend, which goes more into understanding why that happened. But what I can briefly say is the reason why this happened. No, not Stalin didn't later do that though. Masilimum. This is what I'm trying to point out. Stalin was fighting against Zionism, like even in its embryonic form. Okay? The trend that supported Zionism is the same trend that supported Trotskyism. You have to understand, who's the leaders after Stalin in USSR? Do you think those people came from nowhere? They were there when Stalin was a leader. This is what you have to understand, right? The reason why USSR, in a sense, was able to be as militantly revolutionary as it was for so long was because of the popularity of Stalin amongst the masses, where even corrupt leaders were steamrolled by people wanting very urgently to follow the party line. So even those corrupt motherfuckers couldn't get their shit done because Stalin, through guidance that was coming from the Central Committee, would encourage great deals of workers to struggle against those fucking reactionaries, or at least against the reactionary lines, right? So you have to understand that Khrushchev didn't come from nowhere, right? Trotsky didn't come from nowhere. Those reactionaries were there. The Mensheviks were always there. It was a trend they fought against. Trotsky really was just like a Menshevik that decided to be a worm and go into the Bolshevik party when he saw he was in a sinking ship of Mensheviks. He never really stopped that Menshevik bullshit at the end of the day. And that's the trend that supported Israel, is those people. Literally. Whereas the people that had the correct Marxist-Leninist line opposed that. Because they were opposed, because they understood they understood that didn't have anything to do with the national question. That you couldn't create a nation like that, right? And that there was no Jewish nation. Remember, we literally read this last week in Marxism and the National Question, if you go back to Thursday, when Stalin is talking about how there can be no Jewish nation because there is no territory like that. It doesn't mean that Jewish people and the Jewish religion and their practices and all of that should not be preserved, but but that you have to understand that there does not exist that nation because of the lack of a territory. He talks about that. Yeah, you can't tie it to ethnicity. Exactly. And that's what he also talks about as well. So, I may have been incorrectly told he was initially not as vocal about it and got more so as he was proven correct. No. He was very vocal all the time about it. This was one of the things this was one of the reasons why he got rude with Lenin's wife, was a misunderstanding of literally this question that we're talking about right now. Not necessarily in regarding this, but the national question in general, where she was very much on the side of the liberal understanding of oh well, everybody just needs recognition, and that liberal bullshit understanding. That's why he got rude with her, right? And then again, y'all know I've told you about that famous thing where then the letter comes out and they're like, oh, Stalin was rude, so he shouldn't be the leader. And then Stalin even responded to the accusations in that letter in a speech. And he was like, yeah, you're right. Stalin is very rude. Stalin is rude to people who get the national question wrong. And you're right. Maybe you should elect somebody else. I would be happy to step down as chairman of the Communist Party USSR and allow somebody with a gentler hand at these things to take my place. And the party unanimously rejected that. Famously. Yeah, no, those people just they haven't read Marxism and the National Question, because that's a very early work of him talking about it. And again, he's completely against that idea that forms the basis of Yeshivism and also Zionism, right? So yeah, interesting to check that out. All right, I will continue. Like I say though, a good place to learn more about that is Stalin in History and Critique of a Black Legend. When the colonial Israeli entity is transformed into an ethical unit, the political urgency of Palestinian liberation disappears, even as Zionists keep murdering Palestinian children. The liberal can say that Israel still possesses the moral goodwill to negotiate with Palestinians. As long as this moral goodwill exists, any act of colonial warfare on the part of Palestinians will be perceived as an unwarranted aggression that violates the possibility of peaceful dialogue. Amazing. Wow. What an amazingly succinctly put. That's exactly what it is, isn't it? That is literally the bounds of the liberal discourse that were allowed in mainstream politics. No political pressure needs to be placed on Israel. The nation only needs to be convinced that the realization of its guiding narrative lies in the creation of an independent Palestinian state. Schanman notes, quote, the root of the problem identified by the Palestinians and Israelis in what is still the closest they have come to an accommodation remains the same. The Palestinians will gain freedom only when the Israelis find acceptance and security. Blech! And Israelis will achieve that bidathon, the broad Hebrew term for security that so pervades Israelis' consciousness, only when the Palestinians have sovereignty over their lives. Isn't that nice? Both sides, everybody. Both sides. This motherfucker's both sides in good story. An infinite ethical flexibility is conferred upon the colonial conjuncture. The historical antagonism between Israel and Palestine evaporates into a discursive world of free-flowing discussion. Peace can be won through the force of convincing arguments. Against this, one needs to insist that Zionist settler colonialism will not go away on its own, through a self-overcoming dynamic of ethical reflection. On the contrary, it is characterized by a structural inertia caused by the self-maintaining tendencies of an imperialist global political economy. It is in the interest of the US-led geopolitical order to preserve the savagery of Zionist colonization. Right there. They don't need a lobby. They don't need IPAC. They don't need whatever else anyone tries to portray it as. The US, it is in the interest of the US-led geopolitical order to preserve the savagery of the Zionist colonization. Period. It's in its interests. Everything that it does in that regard is in its interests. Don't mistake, we have to not allow people to mistake that. Oh, the US, we don't understand the US, they're letting Israel drag them into this. No. The fact that you're saying that proves that it's working. That's what they wanted to do. They want you to see that and then accuse this of being Israel's fault rather than the war with Iran that the US has always wanted. Now, the next part, Axis of Resistance. In her article on left internationalism, oh God, Aika Kabuku on left internationalism, South Atlantic Quarterly. Sounds cursed, not gonna lie, that sounds deeply cursed. In her article on left internationalism, Kabuku acknowledges the materiality of Israeli colonialism when she notes, quote, how Israel's chief financial, military, and political sponsor, the United States, remains the most destructive state on earth, and the only one that has ever used nuclear weapons, which it houses in military bases across Germany, Turkey, Japan, and elsewhere. But the force that is combating the American empire, namely the axis of resistance, Iran, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, is not even discussed as a potential constituent of internationalist solidarity. On the contrary, Kabuku elaborates an anarchist program of anti-state politics, wherein nebulous desire for freedom performs a function similar to that of liberal pacifist ethics. Warning, we're now going to quote this. Quote, in response to, quote, state-sanctioned internationalisms and their militarist, humanitarian, and legal calculations, we need a left internationalism that does not reflexively wave the flag of any existing nation-state as the primary form of demonstrating solidarity. Oh, fucking get me a violin, for God's sakes, these people. It's already annoying. This is the same people who, when I went on their show, they went, what are your criticisms of DPRK, though? The same kind of person. I can hear this person in my head. At least, what their writing sounds like in my head. If the transcontinental wave of protests for a free Palestine demonstrate the anti-colonial impulse of left internationalism today, its expansive desire for freedom can, indeed, and dream. Trespass, walled exturgencies of the nation state. You hear that? We'll all just protest, and then the colonizers will feel bad, everybody. A real fucking Hassan Abbey fucking analysis going on here. We can think beyond the nation state form in situating our side in war and peace alike. The partial and partisan. We of left internationalism, in any case, can claim sides within humanity and nation to better understand, sustain, and create forms of ecological, social, and political struggle that must exceed them both. Gross. And that is again from that same book, Left Internationalism. Doesn't sound like a book I want to read in its entirety. What I'm hearing is that we need left internationalism that supports neither Washington, nor Moscow, nor Beijing, nor Tehran, nor Pyongyang, nor nor Havana. Absolutely. Yeah, we just need a left internationalism that stands for nothing, actually. Yeah, that's what we need. Wonderful. Wonderful. The elimination of the state form is necessary for the success of revolutionary politics. A state emerges in the course of class struggle, so that the exploitative minority can keep the exploited majority in check through repression and reforms. The state can never establish order by reconciling the classes, as its very function is to ensure that the oppressive interest of the exploiters remains dominant. Given the inability of the state to effect reconciliation, it progressively alienates itself from the masses, constantly acting against their wishes. Consequently, the objective of the left consists in dissolving the state into society, so that the task of governance is carried out by the oppressed themselves. Damn, the framing of that is really well done. But how do we merge the state into the mass activity of society? Kibuku believes that the dissolution of the state has to be carried out in the here and now, through the intervention of democratic forms that exceed the boundaries of the nation state. In the context of the genocidal war in Gaza, this implies a critique of the axis of resistance, which has been using state capacity for defensive industrialization against the US Zionist bloc. Michael Hard and Sandro Mizerda, whom Kibuku cites, asserts that any support for Iran and its allies commits the error of, here we go, campism. It's campism, an ideological approach that reduces the political terrain to two opposed camps and often ends up asserting that the enemy of our enemy must be our friend. Instead of supporting Iran or its allies, even rhetorically, Hard and Mizaderdra declare that an internationalist project should instead link Palestinian solidarity struggles to those such as women, life, freedom movements, which challenge the Islamic Republic. Oh, God, what the fuck? This is a strategy that embeds nation states in a wider context of social revolution, instead of confining oneself to its logic. Herd and Mizedra elaborates, quote, a resistance movement fit for the 2020s would include a range of forces, including local, citywide organizations, national struggles, and regional actors. Kurdish liberation struggles, for example, extend across national borders and straddle social boundaries in Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. From the same work. Just as liberalism presupposes an inherent ethical capacity for peace, anarchist left internationalism presupposes a global space of freedom, where the state can be immediately abolished through the practice of direct democracy. Instead of fighting on the terrain of nation states, one situates them in a broader space where life can be reproduced in a non-status form. Hard and Mizetra label this as a strategy of desertion, in which people simply exit from the state into an international space of freedom. Kibuku also presupposes this space of freedom when she notes how, quote, the forced hand of an either-or position between supporting and condemning Hamas shrinks the space for debate and political transformation in the global movement for a free Palestine. But what if there is no pre-existing space of free, democratic multiplicity into which we can escape? This assumption is simply postulate of liberal epistemology, which grounds politics as an ontological force. The Kurdish movement is cited as an example of a dynamic that exceeds the logic of the nation state and points to anti-statist structures of self-governance. This depiction fails to accurately portray reality. In Syria, for instance, the democratic power of the Kurdish movement is undermined by its entanglement in the imperial structures of American dependency. Rojava is not an enclave of anti-statist popular sovereignty. On the contrary, its existence has been tied to the illegal presence of US military bases, soldiers, advisors, and special forces in Syria. Suzanne Adley, Max Alger, and Amaju Baraka, A.L., response to A Call to Defend Rojava, Monthly Review Online, 7th of May 2018. So, the Kurds' legitimate right to defend themselves against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and against Turkish aggression has been expressed through the geopolitical channels of the American empire. US military support for Rojava is purely motivated by self-interest. American military presence in northeastern Syria allows the US to loot the country's oil and gas reserves, prevents Iran from establishing land connections to the Mediterranean through Iraq and Syria, and contains the influence of Russia and China. The entanglement of the Rojava experiment with US imperialism demonstrates that there is no global space for freedom, where the state can be abolished through the practice of democracy. Rather, one has to construct that space by defeating the forces of imperialism. If emancipatory politics simply ignores the state and tries to escape into anti-statist enclave, it will soon be forced to face the reality of the imperial state power. In the context of the war in Gaza, this means that Zionist settler colonialism cannot be dismantled if the National Liberation Movement chooses to bypass the system of state sovereignty. State power does not stop existing if we pretend that this is the case. Rather, the collective state power of the US Zionist bloc has to be concretely destroyed if people are to attain freedom. The exercise of freedom on the global level requires that people have the capacity to manage their lives without any form of coercion. Relationships of hierarchy should give way to self-governed associations in which everyone can participate. However, in order to enable this universal participation, one has to first deal with the forces that are opposed to it. Freedom for Palestine means combating the enemies who desire the continuation of colonial domination. The enemies constitute a US-led system of imperialism. As long as this imperialist system exists, there can be no free association of peoples that can reconcile conflicts. It is this very irreconcilability of antagonism that accounts for the existence of the state. The state arises only when class antagonism cannot be reconciled. At the level of the world system, the class struggle expresses itself through the divide between the global north and the global south. The core capitalist countries of the north assert extraterritorial sovereignty over southern states, thus weakening their power of independent decision making. Given people's irreconcilable antagonism with the imperialist class, they have to use violence against such counter-revolutionary forces. Social interaction cannot be carried out through the democratic mechanism of free association because there are still imperialist powers that are irreconcilably opposed to freedom. This irreconcilability gives rise to the state, to the use of organized violence by one class against another. Is that Lenin, The State and Revolution? No, that part was from 20 Theses on Politics, Enrique Dussel. The persistence of an imperialist international system necessitates the formation of an apparatus of violence that can suppress the resistance of dominant groups vis-a-vis Palestine. The axis of resistance serves precisely that function. Its use of state capacity for defensive wars undermines the geopolitical stability that is required for the perpetration of imperialism and Zionism in the Arab region. The anti-imperialist state reflects the attempted counter-domination of one part of global society, people of the global north, over the rest of society, the imperialist rulers of the global north. And now, against moral responsibility. Against moral responsibility. Insofar as Western philosophy grounds politics, and then Francesca Albanese gets in a weird spot where she herself condemns Hamas. And thus falls into this liberal, expecting this realm of political discussion to be able to exist. But I digress. Against moral responsibility. Insofar as Western philosophy grounds politics in an ontological element, it converts practice into mere means for the realization of a theoretically posited capacity or possibility. Anti-colonial struggle is jettisoned as a superfluous dynamic that can be replaced by attention to a more fundamental ontological reality. And solidarity with her, right? But you see exactly what I've said before about reformism and how it doesn't matter if you condemn Hamas or not, because even though she did that, she's still subject to sanctions, isn't she? So what good did that condemnation do her, you know? Other than to, again, contribute to this misunderstanding of there being this possibility of reconciliation between settler colonial genocide and those fighting against it. In the last instance, this fundamental ontological reality is reducible to the liberal insistence on the use of pre-given ethical capacities against revolutionary emphasis on the necessity of intensifying struggle. Celia Ben-Habib, for instance, writes about the cruel cycle of violence, almost biblical and apocalyptic in its ferocity, that is underway in Gaza, underlining that a ceasefire must end the extremist practice by Hamas and right-wing Israeli parties. Celia Ben-Habib. An open letter to my friend who signed Philosophy for Palestine, the Hannah Arendt Center, 4th of November, 2023. What does it mean to say that the genocidal war in Gaza is a cycle of violence? It implies that the brutality of Zionism is part of a broader pattern of self-perpetuating violence, wherein the violence of the colonizers begets the violence of the colonized. The dehumanization of Palestinians by Israelis invites a reciprocal dehumanization on the part of the Palestinians, creating a cycle, quote unquote, in which the oppressor and the oppressed come to mirror each other. When discussing Operation Alaska Flood, Adam Schatz says that it can be explained on account of the, quote, rage fueled by the intensification of Israeli repression. This mimicry keeps reinforcing itself. The sadism of Hamas's attacks makes it easier for Israel to portray its enemies as Nazis, rekindling collective memories passed down from one generation to the next, of pogroms and the Holocaust. In the end, Schatz makes Palestinians responsible for the inhumane violence they are facing from the Zionist colonizers. He essentially asks the colonized, quote, why do you keep mimicking the colonizers? Can't you act as a responsible moral agent and strive for freedom in a more peaceful manner? Unquote. The assumption is that morally upright behavior on the part of the colonized will lessen the sense of insecurity prevalent among the colonizers, and thus convince them of the necessity for peace. The model of moral responsibility that underpins Schatz's retelling of Operation Alaska Flood participates in the ontological turn that dominates Western philosophy. That is from Adam Schatz, Vengeful Pathologies, London Review of Books, 2023. Judith Butler talks about the capacity to judge that can help us gain valuable knowledge and thus furnish a truer understanding of the situation. In Palestine, since this capacity to judge can be exercised, nothing can exonerate Hamas from the responsibility for the hideous killings they have perpetrated. Butler calls this a different political morality, a patient and courageous way of learning and naming. Judith Butler, Compass of Mourning, London Review of Books, 2023 again. It is very counterintuitive to characterize the colonial relation of hierarchy as a pedagogical process involving the acquisition of knowledge. Indeed, Palestinians and Israelis are converted into moral agents who can engage in critical dialogue if they choose to pay attention to the ethical capacities that they possess. When evaluated from the viewpoint of this ethical capacity, both the colonizer and the colonized can be indicted for having failed to carry out mutual dialogue. But what allows us to posit such a pre-given ethical capacity? If we assume the presence of such a capacity, then politics is hardly allowed any autonomy of its own. Its script is preset by the need to realize the moral agency which each one of us carries. Against the ontologicization of politics, one must begin in the midst of politics, where no ethical capacity is ensured. In this, politics without guarantees, the colonized no longer function as placeholders for the fundamental ethical psychological capacity. Rifat Alier, a Palestinian poet and academic killed by Israeli forces on December 6, 2023, asserts Palestine as, quote, a fascinating entity that Israel still refuses to allow to exist in reality. In place of a fully present ethical possibility of emancipation, we have a fascinating dynamic that wants to be realized, even though it is not part of reality. Palestine circulates as an insistence on life and a determination to live. The permanent reality of colonial death surely makes it impossible to live freely. But the impossibility of a free life doesn't mean that there is no desire for survival. The oppressiveness of Zionism strokes the desire for survival. This desire is maintained and reinforced through practices of solidarity, such as storytelling. As Rifat says, quote, the desire to describe and explore the experiences of life, including, in this case, that of death, so that others might lead a better life, is the very act of samud, or steadfastness, that has long characterized Palestinian life. Rifat Alier, editor's introduction, and Gaza Writes Back. Virginia Just World Books, 2013. The desire that Rifat talks about is not a drive towards freedom that is just waiting to be realized. On the contrary, it is a desire that grows from the granularies of life and death. In a poem, Rifat writes, we dream and pray, clinging to life even harder. Every time a dear one's life is forcibly rooted up, we live, we do. Rifat Alier, and we live on. Mondowis, 27th May 2012. Bug, stop it! Stop biting it, Bug! No! You gotta stop biting the railing! You're bad! Sorry about that, chat. The desire to cling to life is reinforced through encounters with death. Life is not an untarnished capacity, but a repeatedly performed act of living. We live. A repetition that demands collective renewal after every tragedy. The necessity of renewal means that the desire for life is connected to memory, to the task of inscribing experiences in the materiality of transmissible stories. The model of moral responsibility that dominates philosophical discussions of Gaza follows an opposite path. Memory in this case is treated as a stable expression of the ever-present ethical capacities that nations possess. Pankaj Mishra, for example, talks about the Holocaust as a universal reference for the post-1945 world order, which was apparently defined by a set of common ideals: respect for freedom, tolerance for the otherness of beliefs and ways of life, solidarity with human sufferings, and a sense of moral responsibility for the weak and persecuted. Pankaj Mishra, The Shoah After Gaza, London Review 2024. The Reconstruction after 1945 was not so much about modern values as it was about the political struggle of socialist and national liberation regimes against US expansionism. Stop it, would you? Get the fuck out of here! Oh my god, this cat. Really makes political education hard sometimes, Bugga. Sorry, Tat. Okay. The Reconstruction after 1945 was not so much about modern values as it was about the political struggles of socialist and national liberation regimes against US expansionism. There was no ready-made global edifice, but only a turbulent antagonism between imperialist capitalism and anti-systematic forces. Any universal morality had to emerge from this antagonism. Mishra, on the contrary, presupposes the existence of such a morality and wants to recover it without the need for concrete struggle. He advances an abstract ethics that would revive a lost moral ideal. Thus, he locates Israeli brutality not in settler colonial character of Zionism, but in the nihilistic survival of the strongest ideology propagated by all Israeli governments since the Menschman began. The assumption is that there is an inner nucleus of Zionism that can be retrieved from the exigencies of extremism. Israel is accordingly consecrated as an ethical agent with whom peaceful dialogue is possible and necessary. Since militant anti-colonial struggle is not necessary, Operation Alaska Flood can be demonized as a series of massacres and hostage takings. Mishra also worries that the global South's indifference towards the inflated value of the Shoah risks turning the color line into the Maganut line. That's why, in the end, he wants to preserve the Shoah as a measure of all crimes, and anti-Semitism as the most lethal form of bigotry. Enzo Traverso similarly eulogizes the status of the Holocaust as a paradigm for constructing the memory of other forms of mass violence. He worries about the damage that Israeli violence is causing to the memorial sanctity of the Holocaust. So we're now getting into a different work other than that last person. Now, Anzio Traverso we're looking at. Quote, if this memory were identified with the Star of David, worn by an army carrying out genocide in Gaza, the consequences would be devastating. Our points of reference would be blurred, both epistemologically and politically. We would then enter a world where everything is equivalent and words no longer have any value. A whole series of reference points that make up our moral and political conscience. The distinction between right and wrong, defense and offense, oppressor and oppressed, perpetrator and victim, would be in danger of serious damage. Our conception of democracy, which is not just a system of laws and institutional arrangements, but also a culture, a memory, a set of experiences, would be weakened. The feeling of disorientation that Traverso talks about is linked to the specific intellectual mindset. Politics should be subordinate to the unicarity of moral function, to the clarity of firmly established memory. This memory serves as a universal moral code, guaranteeing the distinction between right and wrong, defense and offense, oppressor and oppressed, perpetrator and victim. Since these moral distinctions are etched into the collective consciousness of the world, fierce struggle between antagonism can be substituted by universal compliance with pre-established norms. When politics is being compared to the abstract goal of dialogical ethics, it is inevitable that Traverso will see Operation Alaska Flood as a, quote, terrorist act. Instead of emotionally enthusiasing over its execution, he asks us to undertake a necessary effort at contextualization and rational understanding, quote unquote. Traverso laments that we are not in any position today to analyze the situation with the necessary critical distance, since history is always written after the event. Despite this, he asserts that, quote, certain things are quite clear. Both Hamas and Israel are guilty of committing massacres. The memory of the Holocaust thus functions as a transcendental viewpoint, a universal reference, from which the participants of the political struggle can be condemned. The memory of the Holocaust crystallizes a moral code that all political participants should adhere to in times of disorientation. Rifat, however, does not presume the existence of such a moral code. He highlights a condition wherein the possibility of dialogue, ethics, is shattered by the physical weight of the colonial war machine. Universal adherence to a moral code established by the Holocaust is possible if words have the chance to change the enemy's conscience. It is this possibility of appealing to morality that is thrown in doubt by colonial violence. In 2022, Rifat asks, quote, can a story or a poem change the mind or the heart of the occupiers? Can a book make a difference? Will this calamity, this occupation, this apartheid pass? Does a single Palestinian life matter? Does it? Rifat. In the face of lifelong terror, Gaza speaks truth to power. In these times, 12th of August 2022. In 2023, facing the possibility of death at the hands of Israeli colonialism, his question changed into a definitive assertion. Quote, Israel could kill all 2.3 million of us, and the world would still not bat an eye. The absence of a moral conscience on the part of the colonizer means that the colonized cannot be expected to behave as perfect victims, peacefully asking their oppressors to give up their privileges. This is simply a liberal fantasy of infinite ethical capacity. In his genocide diaries, Rifat negates this fantasy, noting the sheer levels of despair that can seep into colonized subjectivity. He writes about a stage of colonial war characterized by silence and numbness. Quote, this is when Israel particularly intensifies the bombing of civilian homes. Stories are interrupted, prayers are cut short, meals are left uneaten, showers are abandoned. Therefore, amid the chaos and danger, Israel brings many in Gaza, especially children, withdraw into silence. They find solace in solitude as a means of coping with the overwhelming emotion and uncertainty that surrounds them. Silence prevails. Then numbness follows. As people attempt to protect themselves from the constant onslaught of distressing news, they grow indifferent. Because we could die anyway, no matter where we go. Emotional numbness sets in as individuals attempt to detach from their emotions to survive. Rifat El-Yair. The unpublished genocide diaries of Rifat El-Yair, The Electronic Intifada, 23rd of August 2024. In a conjuncture where no ontological capacity is ensured for the maintenance of dialogical ethics, memories have become political tools of collective self-making. Instead of functioning as expressions of a pre-given moral code, a memory-based moral code is effective only if the agents to which it is addressed possess intrinsic capacity to take heed of it. But when the presupposition of such an intrinsic capacity is discarded, memories become the means for reconstructing political power among different social groups. Rifat configures memories as situated acts that promote remembering and condemn forgetting, an active resistance to an occupation that works hard to obliterate and destroy links between Palestine and Palestinians. Against the colonial drive towards the annihilation of the native, Rifat wants to engrave atrocities and rare moments of hope into the fabric of memories. As a partisan in the national liberation struggle, he wants to weave powerful memories so that the colonized can gain the ability to confront and ultimately defeat the colonizers. Quote, "We Palestinians will keep breathing down your necks until you realize that occupation needs to end, or else we will spoil your most intimate moments by yelling at the top of our lungs, 'Enough is enough!'" Once memories are embedded in the strategic necessities of political struggle, they are completely delinked from any ontologicalized or ethicized foundation. The Holocaust cannot serve as a moral evaluator of politics. Assuming the existence of such a moral evaluator converts political agents into moral entities with a pre-given capacity for conforming to a fixed universal code. However, politics knows no such capacities. Israel cannot be treated as a moral entity whose narratives need to be respectfully engaged with. Rather, it needs to be understood as a colonial machine that provides material and emotional security to its settler population. If the sense of security enjoyed by the colonizers is not disrupted, then there is no possibility of reconciliation. The future of philosophy. Since the colonial situation presents us with an irreconcilable antagonism between the colonizer and the colonized, philosophy cannot arrogate to itself the right to conduct a moral dialogue. Moral dialogue works only if the entities possess a pre-given capacity to exchange knowledge about each other. However, the colonizer is not concerned with an exchange of knowledge. It is a brutal machine that wants to eliminate the colonized. The colonized, similarly, are not perfect victims with an infinite ethical power for dialogue. They exist under the oppressiveness of colonial death, wherein the desire for freedom has to be repeatedly cultivated through the construction of counter-hegemonic collective power. Lenin remarked that the capacity for proletarian self-emancipation does not come ready-made. Rather, it is forged in the extremes of the exploiter's resistance, which teaches the proletariat to ferret out its enemies from their last nook and corner, and to pull up the roots of their domination. Instead of beginning from the assumption of an unlimited ethical capacity, one has to begin amidst the materiality of extremes, namely the violence of the oppressor that necessitates the formation of anti-colonial violence from the oppressed. When an interview asked Ghassan Kanafani, "Why not just talk to the Israeli leaders?" he powerfully replied, quote, "That is kind of a conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean." A conversation between the colonizer and the colonized is never a moral exercise in discovering a common ethical capacity. It is always a deeply political act of warfare that will result in the annihilation of natives if carried out with naivete. Conversation can happen, knowledge can be produced and transmitted, only if the colonized can damage the insular infrastructure of material and emotional security enjoyed by the colonizer. In his last interview, Rifat said, quote, "I am an academic. Probably the toughest thing I have at home is an expo marker. But if the Israelis invade us, if they barge at us, open door to massacre us, I am going to use that marker. Throw it at the Israeli soldiers, even if that is the last thing that I will be able to do." The expo marker, a symbol of knowledge, is thrown into the combative exteriority of a militant struggle. Philosophy is no longer tasked with the disclosure of moral reservoirs of humanity. There is no such hidden moral capacity. Everything takes place on the surface, on the terrain of politics. Instead of searching for a noble power for freedom in everyone, one is faced with the urgency of combating the savagery of colonialism. We are helpless and we have nothing to lose, stresses Rifat. In this moment of desperation, Rifat chose to direct philosophy outwards, towards the imperative of revolutionary struggle. For him, philosophy functioned as an act of life, wielded by a proud stone thrower like him. Western philosophy continues to suppress this imperative, floating in the sovereignty of the contemplative consciousness. The duty falls upon us, dear comrades, you chatters, you wonderful lurkers. The duty falls upon us to destroy this anti-political philosophical tradition through militant participation in revolutionary struggle. The Sword and the Neck, Yanis Iqbal.